Hello, everyone. While we're waiting for audience members to stream in, I'll take a couple of minutes to walk through announcements today and set the context a little bit for today's talk. So we have a lot of new people in the audience today who probably aren't as familiar with CPHS as some of the other people here. So to those of you, welcome. We have two different kinds of events. You may have found out about us by joining us for our research seminar. We usually aim to have one research seminar every month, and that is where a researcher using CPHS data presents some interesting and important research. This talk is slightly different, and this is part of a series of talks that we call the How We Do It series. The How We Do It series is meant to be slightly more technical on aspects of how CMI runs the survey. We aren't covering new research here. Our aim is to try and answer questions about how the survey is run and communicate to a wide audience, not just our users, the various things that go into running CPHS. To do this, there are two of us here today. My name is Kaushik Krishnan. I work at CMI in the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey division. My job is to make the record level data from CPHS available to researchers and to try and help users and researchers understand the data. Along with me, I have Mahesh Vyas. Mahesh is the MD and CEO of CMI. Mahesh is also the person who invented CPHS. He is the chief architect of CPHS. He knows CPHS better than anybody else. He is also the author of our documentation on CPHS. Mahesh, welcome. Today, we are going to take you through the member roster. I will spend an hour taking you through some of the technicalities of the roster. As audience, you are welcome and encouraged to ask us lots of questions. Please type your questions in the Q&A box. As I'm speaking, Mahesh will try and answer these questions in the Q&A chat itself. Once I'm done, half an hour is reserved in case there are questions that spill over, where Mahesh and I will jointly try to answer those questions live. Finally, a quick note on announcements for events over the next 2 months. Next month, we're going to have a very interesting CPHS research seminar. Oops, excuse me. Somebody seems to have logged in using the CMI account into the Zoom webinar. Can you please log out, whoever you are? Thank you. Sorry about that. Sorry about that, audience. So as I was saying, the calendar over August and September is already on the screen in front of you. Next month, we have a very interesting talk by researchers at the Tata Cornell Institute who have been using data from CPHS to study issues around nutrition. We're very excited to have them presenting at the webinar, at the research seminar series, excuse me, and we will be in touch shortly with the dates for that. Along with that, I will be giving a talk which is meant to be a general purpose introduction to CPHS. So especially for those of you who are new to CPHS, who would like us to zoom out a little bit and give you the lay of the land, please join us next month for an introduction to the survey. In September, we're going to have Kunal Mangal, who has recently completed his PhD from Harvard University and is now doing a postdoc at the Azim Premji University. Kunal will be speaking on a very interesting topic having to do with the demand and supply of government jobs, again using CPHS data. Kunal will be presenting in September. We will let the audience know on the exact date of Kunal's presentation. Please also join us in September for what we think is one of the most interesting sessions that we run. September will mark the first month after a wave is complete. We're currently in the middle of wave 23 of CPHS. That is completed on the 31st of August. So in September, we will do a recap of the wave. We'll tell you about the difficulties of surveying, some of the joys of surveying, some of the stories that came out of surveying during wave 23, and we'll talk you through some interesting stories that we're finding in the data. So please join us for all of these events. If you are here today, you're going to be on our mailing list, so you will receive notifications about all future events. We look forward to having all of you. With that being said, I'm going to start today's talk, which is on the member roster. So In many ways, the best place to start in talking about CPHS is to describe the breadth of indicators that we capture. In every round of the survey, we capture over 600 indicators for all of the households that participate in the survey. And these are on a range of things. Some of them are about individuals, some of them are about households. A lot of them have to do with income, and a lot of them have to do with consumption expenditure. In a nutshell, these themes are covered in CPHS. CPHS happens 3 times a year. Every household in the survey, in the sample, is interviewed 3 times a year. We've been doing this for 7 years and counting now without a break. And today, the sample is over 177,000 households large. This is a panel survey, it's a longitudinal survey. So these households participate in every single round of the survey. Those of you who come to our events regularly will notice that this number is even higher than the number that I quoted last time, and that's because we are in the middle of a sample expansion as I speak. So we're currently a little over 177,000 households. But today's talk is not about all of that. Today's talk is focusing more on a key set of indicators. These are indicators about the individuals that live inside the households that participate in the survey. And on each of these themes, there are a variety of indicators that are captured. All of this is data that's at the individual level, despite the fact that our survey is a household survey. And there's a lot of research that's come out of these indicators. Just some of the recent research, I'll take a minute to recount. Earlier, I think this week or perhaps last week, a paper written by Rosa Abraham, Surbhi Kesar, and Amit Pasole at Azim Premji University has recently been published. They presented this work at our seminar some months ago. One of the findings, one of the big findings that they have is that women daily wage workers were 7 times more likely to have lost their jobs during COVID compared to their salaried counterparts. And this is a very large and startling number. Similarly, Ashwini Deshpande, who was the first speaker at the CPHS research seminar, her paper that she presented has also been recently published. Among the many results that Ashwini finds, I find this result to be a very interesting result, which is that there's been a huge drop in the amount of time people spent hanging out with friends during COVID. Ashwini estimated this using the data from the Time Use survey, which is a part of CPHS. And for those of you who have joined us for our other events this month, Anup Malani, Sabarish Ramachandran, Abhishek Anand, Justin Sandifer, and Arvind Subramanian, 2 different sets of researchers presented 2 different estimates on likely excess deaths from wave 1 and wave 2 of COVID. All of these are estimates of something that's happening at the individual level, whether it's female workers, whether it's people and how they spend their time, or whether it's excess deaths. This is something that happens to people. So the question is, how come up with these kinds of results from a household survey? Because after all, this is not called the Consumer Pyramids individual survey. It's not called the Consumer Pyramids family survey. It's called the Consumer Pyramids household survey, right? And let's put things in perspective again before we dive into this thing called the member roster. There are 177,541 households that participate in every single round of the survey. But that's households. If we look at individuals, we have over 870,000 individuals inside these households who are directly surveyed by us. This is not extrapolation. These are people for whom we collect data through the survey because they are members of these households. But CPHS is only incidentally a database of these almost 1 million people. But it's exactly these people that I want to spend some time talking to you about today. These people that live inside these households, that qualify as members of the household, how do we find them? How do we identify them? How do we track them? What do we know on them, etc.? So the agenda for today's talk is as follows. 1, I'm going to tell you who qualifies to be counted as a member of a household. 2, I'm going to talk you through something which is very core to CPHS called the CPHS member roster. 3, I'm going to tell you about the different kinds of statuses that members in the household can have. 4, I'm going to walk you through implications of all of this when it comes to using the data from CPHS, which is available in a subscription service called Consumer Pyramids DX, or CPDX for short. And then 5, I'm going to talk to all of you about how the limits of the data that are collected in CPHS are getting pushed by researchers and how everybody can benefit from this. Okay, so first, who is a member of a household? To start, I need to tell you what a household is according to us. A household is a fairly simple idea for us. A household is just a physical structure with members residing in it. But what I'm keen that all of you take away today is that it's the household that is the ultimate sampling unit in CPHS. This means that individuals are not directly selected into CPHS. Rather, household members are selected into CPHS as an outcome of household selection. We select households randomly across India. We don't select individuals randomly across India. The individuals that live inside those households are inducted into the survey by virtue of living in those households. Right? But who qualifies to be a member of a household? So I'll give you a working definition, and this can be a little unwieldy, so we'll try to break it down for you. Household members are individuals who usually reside in the household at the time of the survey interview and who have been residents of the household over the 4 months preceding the date of the interview. That's CPHS's working definition of a member of a household. But there's a lot here, so let's try and unpack it. And first, let's unpack the most important part of this definition, the word reside. What does it mean for you to reside inside a household? Well, first, it means that you share food from the same kitchen as other people in that household. Second, it means that you spend most of your non-working hours in or around the household. Third, it means that you use the household as a place of rest. Fourth and finally, it means that you have access to common household facilities. Among all of these criteria, the one that's the most important for us is that you share food from the same kitchen. This is really critical in determining whether you reside in the household. Something else that's very critical is having access to common household facilities. And I want to tell you a little bit about what that means in the text of CPHS. What it means is that you have to be a beneficiary of some common indivisible household expenses, things like rent, electricity, water, sanitation, food expenditure, and entertainment expenditure. Remember, you just have to be a beneficiary. You don't have to necessarily be paying for these things, but you have to be a beneficiary of these things that are paid for usually on behalf of the household and all of its members. Just saying that you have a postal address somewhere is insufficient for you to be considered to be a member of a household. Let's talk a little bit more about this definition. Now that we have some sense of what this word reside means, let's focus on an equally important word, usually. So what does it mean for you to usually reside in a household? Well, there's a clue, and the clue is in the 4 months that's already in the definition. Let me try and elaborate this a little bit. Who's not a member of a household? If you have a visiting relative or a friend who stays temporary, they just happen to be there at the time of the interview of the household, those people are not considered members. Even if they're here for a prolonged period of time, you might have an aunt that's moved in with you because of COVID. You might have a friend that's moved in with you because of a job loss. What matters is, do they have an intention of leaving? And have they lived in the household for 4 months? The people who usually reside in the household are people who don't have a clear intention of leaving and who've lived in the household for 4 months. Now, there are some exceptions, not exceptions, but let's say subtleties to this rule. A usual resident who's traveling at the time of the interview is still considered to be a member, even if they're not present at the time of the interview. They could even be traveling for a majority of the 4-month period. Example, people whose work requires them to travel a lot. They're going from city to city to city. Maybe they're salespeople. Maybe they run a nationally representative survey and have to travel a lot. Even in those cases, even if they're traveling for the majority of the 4-month period, they're still considered to be residents. In many cases, people go on long religious pilgrimages. Even then, they continue to remain residents of the household. There are some exceptions that work in the other direction. For example, students that live in dorms, they're not residents of the household, even if they come home every single weekend to do their laundry, because they don't usually live in the household. They usually live in a dorm, not in the household. Newborns and their mothers are another exception. Newborns and their mothers are considered residents even if they've been residents for less than a 4-month period. Especially in India, it's often the case that mothers travel somewhere else outside of the household that they live in to give birth. And so when the newborn and the mother return to the household, they are reclassified as members, or in the case of the newborn, classified as a member of the household, even though they may not have been in the household for the last 4 months. Right? Our purpose here is to have a rule that's a working definition that makes sense in deciding who's a member of the household and who's not, but not something that's so strict that we obviously exclude people that should be included or obviously include people that don't deserve to be included. Okay. Uh, Keep in mind, there's nothing in this definition that talks about family. And this goes back to something I said at the beginning. This is not the Consumer Pyramid's family survey, it's the Consumer Pyramid's household survey. The requirement, the fundamental requirement, is that people share the same kitchen and other facilities. There's nothing here about having to share blood relations. In fact, live in help, paying guests, a household full of roommates sharing no blood relations are all considered to be members of the household. Let's take this one step further. This is not a family survey because family members that don't live in the household simply aren't known to us. Right? So, in the opposite direction, those people that are family members but don't live in the household aren't counted in the survey. Even among residents, CPHS does not map the complete relational tree. What I mean by that is we only map your relation for a member of the household to the head of the household. Everybody's mapped to the head, not to each other. Because in a generalized setting where we allow even for non-family members to live together, the huge, complete, arbitrary relational network is far too large to store and to map for every single one of the 177,000 plus households in the survey. So what we do instead is we map everybody to the head of the household. But that's something that can be done, and that's a place where we can accommodate both family blood relations as well as non-family non-blood relations, like for example, live-in help or roommates or paying guests. Now that you know a little bit about who qualifies as a member of the household, it makes sense for us to tell you now about the CPHS member roster. Okay, so what is this thing called the member roster? The member roster is just a table, and it looks something like this. There's a household ID, there's a member ID, there's a name for every person, there's age, and then there's all kinds of other things. Okay, what do you need to keep in mind when you're looking at this table? The important thing to keep in mind is that household IDs are unique. So within a household ID is the same, but across households, across time, a household has the same ID in CPHS. The same thing is true for members. Within a household, members have the same unique member ID across time, no matter whether we met this member in 2014 or 2019 or 2021. They have the same member ID, and the household has the same household ID. If you take them together, you get a unique individual ID for every single person in the survey. This doesn't change over time. This doesn't change across data sets. You can always use this to link data sets across time, across themes, and that's what makes CPHS very powerful. Now, on top of this, there's some information that's sensitive, that's personally identifying. We don't release that information to users. What we do release is other information, things like age. And what we do release are the anonymized member IDs and household IDs. Now, this thing, this member roster, this table that has household IDs, member IDs, names of people, and demographic information about them, it's updated each wave. So the household member roster might look like this in wave K. It might look a little different in wave K+1 and a little different in wave K+2. Each wave, interviewers receive a list of all the relevant members as of the last wave of the survey. And then when they're at the household, they make updates to that list. Right? So it's going to look something like this. You'll see people aging over time. You'll see people joining the household. You could even see people leaving the household. But I want to take you first through some of the changes we made in how we do the update process, and then walk you through the way in which people can evolve through the member roster. The most critical thing that we'd like users to know, users, researchers, anybody that's interested in CPHS, is that the member roster formally took shape only in wave 3. Wave 3 was the last wave in 2014. So it's only from wave 3 onwards that we have a formal, dedicated, stable member roster. We had a member roster before that, but this was when we had immediately started the survey in wave 1 and wave 2. And it was still adjusting. We were still learning how to survey, and we were still determining what are the quality control features that we can put into this to make the member roster really be rock solid. So it's from wave 3 that we recommend that you can use the member roster to do interesting things. Now, who's in the member roster is also something that's changed a little bit over time. Until wave 7, each time an interviewer went to a household and updated information in the roster, that updated information from the interviewer was only accepted in the master database if the entire interview of that household was accepted after the QA checks that we do. In wave 8, we relaxed that constraint a little bit, and we allowed the roster to be updated with new information on members in the case of fully accepted household records in the survey, as well as those household records that we call recheck failed records. Now, to understand this, I need to tell you a little bit about our QA processes and how the survey is conducted. So if you look at the top right-hand side of your screens, you'll see a little diagram to try and illustrate this. There are two layers when the survey is happening in the field. There's the interviewer layer and then there's the supervisor layer. Supervisors don't run interviews. Interviewers don't supervise, don't do quality control. Okay. So the first thing that happens is an interview, and that's conducted by the interviewer. Once the interview is complete, all of this is done, by the way, on CMI's proprietary technology platform that runs on handheld smartphones. So the interviewer collects all this information on their smartphone. Once they're done, they hit the submit button. This information is immediately beamed back to CMI HQ and then beamed back again to supervisors in real time who look at the data that's been collected and they check whether the data is good enough to be accepted into the survey. Now, a supervisor can do one of the following things. All of these happen in real time within minutes or hours of the data being collected, almost always on the same day. The supervisor can choose to accept the record and say, all right, everything in this interview seems fine. The record goes straight into the master database. Or the interviewer can reject the record and say, nope, this is atrocious and this just cannot go into the database. If the interviewer rejects something, then the same household is replanned for interview again and assigned to a brand new interviewer because the first interviewer that went to that household did such a poor job that somebody else needs to go to that household now. Okay? That's what happens when a supervisor rejects a record after the interview was complete. There are other things a supervisor can do. A supervisor can say, I'm not going to reject this outright, but I need you to resurvey the household. So it's very similar to rejection. The difference is that the household is replanned for an interview again, but it goes to the same interviewer as before. So it's not so bad that a brand new interviewer has to go. The same interviewer can do the job, except they need to now do it all over again, go to the household all over again, collect that data. That's called resurveying as opposed to rejecting. And then the last thing that a supervisor can do is the supervisor can say, you just need to recheck some of the data. I don't need you to go and redo the entire survey, but there are a couple of fields here where I need you to check with the household whether this information is accurate. That's what's called a recheck. Sometimes a recheck can't be done, and that's called a recheck failure. It can't be done either because the interviewer wasn't able to complete it in time. Now, this isn't something I'm going to talk about a lot in this talk, but those of you that have attended previous talks know about this. And if you don't know about this, please join us next month. I'll be talking a lot about this. We have very strict timelines for surveys and interviews to be completed. If a household cannot be interviewed within the week that it's supposed to be interviewed, then that household is not interviewed for the purposes of the survey in that way. In some cases, we allow some exceptions, but like I said, I'll talk about that on another time. So there are very strict time limits, and sometimes interviewers aren't able to complete the recheck within the time that they're given. Or even after they did the recheck was still not accepted. That's called a recheck failure. So with this information now, let's go back to the slide that we were talking about and look at the expansion that we made in Wave 8. We continue to allow updates to the member roster when the entire interview is accepted, no problem. And only in the case of recheck failures, that's most of the survey is okay, but a couple of fields need to be rechecked. And if those rechecks don't happen, our experience has been those rechecks very rarely affect member roster information. It's usually about some of the other 600 indicators that we capture. And so in those cases, to make sure that we still have a good and up-to-date member roster, even if the recheck fails, we still update the roster so that we have valid and current information. This is the information that interviewers receive. So if you look at the bottom of your screens now, you see the word relevant is highlighted. Now I can define to you what relevant means. The list of relevant members are simply all the members who aren't marked as dead and members who are valid. What I mean by valid is suppose that Ashish, member ID number 3, was added to the roster, but that interview was rejected outright by the survey, and that household was never re-interviewed. In that case, even though Ashish was added to the roster, he's an invalid entry. So he doesn't show up in the next wave. A valid entry is an entry that goes through the QA process, either accepted or recheck failed. So as long as you get through that and the member isn't dead, that member shows up on the screen for the interviewer the next time they show up at the household to check who's living inside this household. This process happens every single time the household is met by us at CPHS, and that happens almost always exactly 16 weeks apart, which is 3 times a year, every single year like clockwork. Okay, now that you understand how the member roster is updated and some of the changes that we made over time, I want to draw your attention to this example and walk you through some of the things that you can expect to change and some of the things that you cannot expect to change and some of the things that you should never expect to see in the data. Okay, so some things are going to change over time, like age. People will age. That means between 2 waves, sometimes somebody who is 43 years old might become 44 years old, or somebody who is 45 might become 46. And that can happen at different times depending on when their birthdays are. Something else that can happen is that members can be added. So a new member, Devi, who was never present in previous waves, is suddenly in the household because Devi's joined the household in wave 3. But some changes are absolutely impossible. So if household ID 732, member ID 3 was Ashish in wave 1, it cannot now suddenly become Alam in wave 2 and then go back to being Ashish in wave 3, because every single person in CPHS has a unique ID. So we have systems in place to prevent things like this from happening. Those systems are mostly the accumulation of the learning that we had in wave 1 and wave 2. Those of you who have attended some of our previous talks on response rates know that we did a large overhaul of the sample as well as the team that operated in Gujarat and Kerala in the first year of our survey operations. One of the reasons for that is exactly this, and we learned very much from that about how to deal with interviewer effects. Now, if you're curious about this and you'd like to know more, our documentation on response rates is available on the website. I encourage all of you to go read it. If not, you can watch the talk that I gave along with Mahesh on response rates a couple of months ago. It's on our YouTube channel, or just get in touch with us and we'll be happy to tell you more. But the point to take away here in today's talk is that some changes are absolutely impossible in the roster because there's very tight technology-driven QA that makes these things impossible. Some things are improbable. They're not impossible, they're improbable, and they happen sometimes. So for example, somebody named Ashish, who's aged 16 in wave 1, in wave 2 suddenly ages by 4 years and becomes 20, and is then stable at the age of 20 until then they increase only year by year. These are improbable, but they're not impossible. And this is the subject of future documentation. So you can expect to see a lot more documentation from us on when these kinds of improbable changes can take place and how often you can expect them and why. The point that I want to emphasize here today is that there can be legitimate data collection reasons for these kinds of jumps. Often, for example, especially when a household is first inducted into the survey, there can be mistakes that are made either by the householders or by the surveyors in terms of capturing information on things like age, especially for relatively young children, especially in households where there aren't birth certificates. All kinds of things happen when you're surveying households across the country. So for some of the variables in CPHS, it takes a while to settle down. In CPHS, we don't want to be so heavy-handed that because somebody said that they were 16 years old in one wave, that they're now locked in at 16. Even if in a subsequent wave they say, no, that was a mistake, I'm actually 20, right? So we need to have a way to account for this, to be able to correct for this. And that's what's done through the processes that we have. Like I said, this is the subject of future documentation and therefore also the subject of future webinars. So we hope that you'll join us for these webinars in the future where we'll explain how these changes in demographics are allowed and the implications that that has for researchers. Okay, now that I've told you everything about the member roster, I'd like to move to telling you about something that's really critical to today's talk and is also critical to the two talks that you saw earlier this month, the two CPHS research seminars by Anup Malani, Sabarish Ramachandran, Abhishek Anand, Justin Sandifer, and Arvind Subramanian. And that is something called member status. If you look at the member roster, there are all kinds of columns in the member roster. It's so wide that I can't even put it on the screen to show you. But one of the columns that is very important is a column called member status. And every member in the household can have a different status, and that status can change over time. So let's take a particular household, fictitious, and a particular wave. And at that point in time, for that household, different members have different member statuses. And I'll walk you through these member statuses and what they mean. I'm going to start with member of the household last, because it makes sense only once you understand all the other categories. So first is a category called immigrated. Immigrated with an I are immigrants, people who have migrated into the household. These are new members to the household who weren't members in the previous interview when we interviewed the household 4 months ago. This categorization of an immigrant was introduced in September of 2020. Before this, people that were members of the household, even if they weren't interviewed in the previous 4 months, as long as they qualified to be a member of the household, they would still be interviewed. But we didn't create this special member status for them called immigrated. We created this status, immigrated, in September of 2020 in response to very legitimate and important user feedback that CPHS might be able to say something about migration, given the extent of migration that was being documented anecdotally and through journalism around the time of the first COVID pandemic, or rather the first wave of the COVID pandemic. So we introduced this new category in member status to track people who've joined a household who weren't previously there at the last interview. Again, keep in mind, this doesn't always apply. This is not true for every single person who wasn't there the previous interview. People like newborn babies, people like returning mothers, they are not marked as immigrants, even if they're observed for the first time after a gap. They're still marked as members of the household. When we capture immigration, we also capture where these people came from. So we know the state, the district, and whether they came from the rural or the urban part of that district. And we know the reasons for their immigration into the household. Did they come here because they lost a job, or they found a new job, or they completed some education where they used to live, or whatever? All of this is captured. So we know reasons as well as locations for those immigrants that enter CPHS households. Now, all of that is going to be the subject of a talk in itself, just about migration. So we hope you'll join us for that talk sometime in the future. But just like immigrants, we also have emigrants with an E. Emigrants with an E are out migrants, people who've left the household. These are past members that moved out for a variety of reasons. Here again, just like with immigration, we capture why they left the household as well as where they went. This is again very vital and important information that can be used by researchers. However, for emigrants, that's out migrants, to be marked, there has to be at least one person from the household that continues to be a member of the household, right? And this makes sense. So suppose there are 4 people living in the household. As long as one of those 4 are still in the household the next time the interview happens, that person can report on behalf of the other 3 and say, well, they've actually left the household now. They've all left. 2 of them went for seasonal employment and 1 of them went for education or something like that. So at least one member needs to continue to reside in the household for us to capture this information, including reasons, including locations. The important thing to note is immigrant records, that's immigrant with an E, out migrant records are persistent. That means that even though Ali, in this case, household ID 732, member ID 4, emigrated out in a particular wave, Ali will show up in the database every single wave marked as emigrated, which means he's not a member of the household, because there's always the possibility that somebody that left the household can come back into the household. And when they re-enter the household, we want to make sure that their records are linked. So we want to make sure that the Ali that left in this wave and comes back to the household maybe 5, 6, 10 waves later, is still the same Ali. And that continuity of the record is critical for you as a researcher to be able to study what's happening. For this reason, emigrant records are persistent. They can always re-enter the household at a future time. We allow for that and we accommodate for that. And when they re-enter, they will always have the same member ID as before. So you can always follow people that leave a household, come back to a household, leave a household, come back to a household, etc. Okay, and that's something that's really critical and useful and important and interesting about the data set. Now that you've understood immigrated and emigrated, which will be the subject of more discussion and more documentation in the future, there's another member status called dead. And it's this member status that was exploited by the authors that presented their work earlier this month. Dead as a status is fairly simple. It just denotes the death of a household member, and death is a permanent state. Okay? So if you become an emigrant with an E, you can always become an immigrant with an I when you enter the household again, and eventually become a member of the household. If you become an immigrant, you can always leave the household, in which case you become an immigrant. But if you're marked as dead, you can't come back from death. And so death is a permanent status, and members marked as dead, they don't show up in the member roster in CPDX after they've been marked as dead. Finally, there's one last status, which is member of the household. This is basically anybody else. Anybody who's not dead, who hasn't emigrated, that's who hasn't out-migrated, who hasn't left the household, and who's been observed in the household for 2 consecutive waves, which means they're not an in-migrant either. Those people are called members of the household. There are exceptions that we allow for our field team to make in the field. Like I said, with the case of infants, with the case of mothers who've recently given birth, who've returned to a household, there are even other exceptions that can be made in the field, and those are listed out in the documentation on member status, on the member roster that's available on our website. What matters when we mark somebody as a member of the household, as opposed to marking them as an immigrant, is in the case of an immigrant, it has to be meaningful to ask 2 follow-on questions, which is, where did you come from and why, right? And if those questions don't make sense, and they're living in the household and they have no intention of leaving the household, they're not a temporary resident, then those people are members of the household. Okay, and so I hope that these explanations of these various statuses are useful to all of you in thinking about what can and can't be done with CPHS. There's one last member status which is really critical to understand. That's called family shifted. And this is something that will never happen to just 1 or 2 members of a household. It'll happen to everybody. So this status is marked to members when all previous occupants of the household have left and they're replaced by a brand new set of occupants. So suppose 4 months ago when I went to household 732, Ravi, Rani and Ashish were living there. And then for all kinds of reasons, maybe they were living in rented accommodation and their lease expired. Maybe they sold their house. Maybe they had to move somebody else and someone else moved in. For any reason, there could be brand new people living in their household 4 months from then. In that case, the old members are marked as family shifted. The new members are marked as members of the household. This is a concept that we introduced into the survey in May of 2016. Before that, if a household experienced a family shift, we simply dropped that household from the panel. But then we realized, well, we're actually dropping very valuable information. What is better to do is to provide this information to researchers and let them determine whether they want to drop these households from their analysis or to keep these households. Keep in mind, this is a very, very, very small number of households. So in wave 22, which is the last wave that we undertook, the number of family shifts were something like 120 out of 170,000 households. 120, not 120,000, just 120 households out of 170,000 households. So less than 1 in 1,000 households. Usually it's probably even less than that. So this doesn't happen very often. But when it happens, we mark it in the data for a researcher. They can make a decision on whether to use the data or not. And if it suits their purposes, they can continue to use this data even though there's a new set of residents living in this household. Member IDs, importantly, are never overwritten. So when a new set of members enter a household and the old set vacate the household, the new set don't get the same IDs as the old set. So Ravi, Rani, and Ashish were members 1, 2, 3 forever. Even if they leave, And when Ali and Devi join the household, they will be members 4 and 5. And members 1, 2, and 3 will never show up in the household again. And that's to make sure that as a researcher, if you're doing something at the member level, as long as you're using the unique individual ID, which is a combination of the household ID and the member ID together, even if by some chance you forget to subset out family shifted observations, that's not going to screw up your results much, because as long as what you're doing is individual specific, you're doing it by a unique individual ID, there's never going to be the problem that that individual ID changes over time, and it references some other individual other than this one individual. Okay, so I've added a little bit more context now to the same chart that we saw earlier. Two new things have happened. One is this family shift notion was introduced, and that was introduced in wave 8, the same time as when we slightly relaxed our rules for member roster updation. And then the immigrated status was introduced in wave 21. We'll be talking in more detail, like I said, about a lot of this in future documentation and future seminars. This talk is to lay the groundwork for all of that future work. Now that we've gone through the various member statuses, what the member roster is, who qualifies to be a member of the household, what a household is as far as CPHS is concerned, I want to spend the rest of this talk, the last 15 minutes of this talk, just talking about some of the implications of all of this when it comes to the use of CPDX or record level data from CPHS by researchers. The first implication is that almost always you as a researcher only want to be dealing with what we call live members. A live member is someone who's either a member of the household or someone who's immigrated, who's an immigrant into the household. Let's distinguish them from the other kinds of members. Dead members, emigrated members, those are out migrants, emigrate with an E, or family shifts. In all three of those cases, those people no longer live in the household, right? So we can't capture information about them because that doesn't make sense to do. They're not residents of the household anymore. They're not members of the household. And they can't tell us anything because they're not there. So the only thing we do in those cases is, as a record keeping, as a bookkeeping exercise, to make sure that our household roster is clean, we mark them as dead or emigrated or family shifted. In the case of immigrants, they can always come back into the household, sure. But at the time that they've emigrated, we don't know anything else other than the fact that they've emigrated, where they've gone, and the reasons for that. But the only people who are answering on the rest of the survey about individuals are the members of the household and the immigrated members. So that's why we call them live members. Okay, they are also the only members in that wave of the data who will have positive member weights. As some of you know, in the case of CPHS, you have to use weights. I've discussed weights in a previous talk. We have a lot of documentation on weights on our website. The important point to note is that live members have positive member weights. Everybody else has a weight equal to 0. And that's again done by construction, by us, in case you include dead people, emigrated people, family shifted people into some data aggregation exercise that you're running, as long as you appropriately weight those observations. Even if those people who are not live members were somehow included in your analysis, they will be dropped out because of the fact that they have a 0 member weight. Okay? But as a user of CPHS data, you should almost always restrict yourself only to live members at responding households. Almost always. If you're Anup Malani, Sabrish Ramachandran, Abhishek Anand, Justin Sandifer, Arvind Subramanian, other people interested in computing death rates, well, then dead people by definition are not among the category of live members. In that case, you have to do something else. But in most cases, you're only going to want to compute something for live members of the household. The easy way to do this in the survey, or I'm sorry, when you're using the data, is through these two conditions. One is subset down only to those households whose data has been accepted. This is a household level condition. You can subset down to those households using the variable response status and only keeping those households that are accepted as response status. And within accepted households, subsetting down only to those members whose member status is either member of the household or immigrated. Okay, this is critical for you to do when you want to compute member level statistics for live members of the household, which is what 99% of our users are going to want to do. Next, suppose that you don't want to include family shifted members in, uh, uh, in some analysis that you're doing. When you're handling member level data, you don't need to worry at all because those members are clearly marked as family shifted, so you can take them out and they're going to have weight 0. So even if they're included in some of your analysis, as long as you weight your observations appropriately, they're going to drop out of whatever analysis you're doing. However, if you're trying to compute something at the household level, and for some reason you only want to keep those households where the entire household composition hasn't changed from wave to wave, even though it's a very small number and it's unlikely to make a difference meaningfully to your analysis, an easy way to do that is we have another indicator at the household level in the data called family shifted. So as long as you subset on those households where family shifted is no, where there hasn't been a change of the occupants of the household, a complete change of the occupants of a household, that's all you need to do. Just subset on family shifted equal to no. Some other things that you probably want to know, depending on the data that you're playing with. If you're interested in working on immigrants, and that's a legitimate interest, you might want to know, for example, of all the people that have left households from CPHS last wave, how many of them moved to North India, to South India, to rural parts of India, to urban parts of India, what reasons did they move for, etc. It's possible to do that using the data that we have. There are a couple of things to keep in mind. First, immigrant records, like I mentioned, are persistent. They can always re-enter the household. What that means is in the micro data, you're going to see the stock of immigrants, not just the flow of immigrants. So in a given wave, it could be that Ali had emigrated this wave as of this interview. Devi had emigrated with an E, out-migrated 2 waves ago, and Ashish had out-migrated 4 waves ago. All of them will show up as emigrated in every single wave because at any wave, they could re-enter the data. So you have to be extra careful when you're doing something with immigrants that you only study, in most cases, the flow of immigrants. And those are people who were marked as a member of the household or immigrated in the last wave and became an immigrant only in this wave. So to do that, you need to exploit the time series. If you don't exploit the time series and you only exploit the cross-section, then you're going to be handling the stock of immigrants instead of the flow of immigrants, which may not be what you're trying to do from a research perspective. But remember, immigrants are not household members, as I described earlier. And so they are not going to have weights. And that's something you as a researcher are going to have to do something about. We don't want to include weights for them because they're not legitimately members of the household and they don't answer questions because they're not there. If you still want to use them, it's possible, but they have 0 weight. And you're going to have to think about what the right and appropriate weighting procedure for that may be, which will depend on your research question and your use case. Now, immigrants. With immigrants, the big thing to remember is that this category was only introduced in September of 2020. This is a break in the data collection process. Before that, we didn't do this. And so you will not see immigrants with an I in pre-September 2020 data. So please take care if you're interested in doing something on immigrants and you're interested in leveraging data that's both pre-September 2020 and post-September 2020, because this category doesn't exist pre-September 2020. Okay, now finally, people who are dead. Some, though there are many caveats here. One, we don't capture the time of death. When somebody is marked as dead, it's because we have a member roster and everybody has to have their place in that roster. So if somebody was present last interview and they're not present this interview, there has to be a reason, and there can only be 2 reasons. One is they're no longer in the household, they've left for some reason, or they've passed away. That's why we capture death. We don't capture death with the intention of being a survey that tries to estimate vital statistics. So we don't capture time of death. We just know that since the last time we interviewed the household, this time this person has died. That could have been in 4 months. If there was non-response, it could have been in 8 months or 12 months or even longer. More importantly, just like emigrated members, dead members have 0 weight. So you can't include them easily in analysis. And as a researcher, you're going to have to do something to determine how to include them in your analysis. And the authors that presented their research earlier this month made decisions themselves independently and perhaps differently on how to handle people who are marked as dead in CPHS, both in terms of attributing time of death as well as in how to handle issues such as waiting. Okay, so those are some of the implications of the way in which we document and keep the member roster for you as researchers when you're using the data. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before going to Q&A is on pushing the limits of CPHS. We've told you about the implications of the member roster for research using CPDX, but we are finding increasingly, and we're very happy to note, that users are really pushing the limits of the survey and of the data. And so when you do that, we'd like to do as much as we can to support you while being the producers of that data. Okay? So the first thing I want to say is that CPHS was never designed to study some issues. So for example, it was never designed to study family structure. It's not a family survey, it's a household survey, which happens to capture some relational information about family structure in households where there are family members living together. So you as a researcher might be interested in studying married couples, which requires you to identify married couples. You might be interested in identifying children and their parents. You might be interested in studying vital statistics. You might be interested in computing birth rate or death rate. You might be interested in migration. You might want to study emigration or immigration. You might be interested in something else that we've not even thought of. The question we're asking ourselves is, what can CMI, as the producer of the data, do to aid researchers when they're pushing what the CPHS survey can do in trying to study some of these areas? And each of these areas, there are different things that can be done, can't be done, and there are different ways in which we as CMI can try to help you in pushing and processing the data. So I'm very happy to say that we are going to announce two new initiatives today. The first of them is about documentation. And I'd like to keep this slide up while I talk about it, just to give you some examples. If you read our documentation on the member roster, we do mention that even though CPHS was not designed to be a vital statistics survey, you might be able to compute birth rate and death rate crudely using the data that's in CPHS. Some researchers have already done this, such as the researchers that presented this month. With birth, you might be able to do the same thing. And we suggest that maybe a 24-month cutoff in terms of age or a 40-month cutoff in terms of age might be a useful way in identifying births, even though they're not clearly identified in the data. Similarly, you might be interested in identifying married couples. You might be interested in identifying children and their parents. But the way in which CPHS works is everybody is related to the head of the household. So you may not be able to uncover unambiguously all married couples, all children and parents, etc. Without overstating or over pushing what the survey can do, what the data can deliver, what we can do is we can provide detailed documentation on these indicators to put together tables for you so that you as a researcher can take an informed decision. For example, the median size of a household in CPHS is 4. So the most likely thing that's going to happen in most households is you'll have only one married couple. But it's useful for you as a researcher to know this. And it would be useful for us as CMI to document how often there's one married couple, multiple married couples, etc., and where it might be a little ambiguous for you as a researcher to identify precisely who's married or precisely who's a child of whom, etc. So what we can do and what we are very keen to do is to push heavily on our documentation over the coming months. And we are going to do indicator-wise documentation on everything that matters to the member roster into individuals. After that, we're going to get to other things as well. But this is an important first step. So you're going to see over the next few weeks and months, documentation on gender, on age, on marital status, on caste, on relationships, on migration, etc. The intent of this documentation is to take these groups of indicators, explain to you how we do the data collection, explain to you patterns that we see in the data, and put together descriptive statistics that make it easy for you as a researcher to determine the degree to which you can push on a particular indicator or set of indicators in the data. Along with that, we're also very happy to say that we're going to start curating and introducing code for the entire community. Now, I want to say something here. This is code that's privately developed by individual researchers who are gracious enough to make it available for the entire community to use. Everyone benefits from these kinds of new techniques and ways of processing the data. So we welcome all researchers who work on CPHS to share their code if they would like to with the broader community. The assumptions that you make and the way in which you process the data matters. Let's go back to the two talks that we had this month. The Malani and Ramachandran team and the Anand, Sandifer, and Subramanian team both produce fairly large estimates of excess deaths, but they're not exactly the same estimate. Some of that has to do with research methodology, and some of it has to do with the way in which they process the data. For example, right? So the way in which you impute the time of death, what you choose to do with weights, because all dead members have zero weight, where you choose to draw the cutoffs of the first wave, the second wave, etc. These are just examples. So it would be very useful for the entire community if authors can put their code out there so that others can benefit from this and can expand on their own research in doing this. And I'm happy to announce that we already have some researchers who have expressed their willingness to share their code with the broader research community. And I hope that we will continue to push on this. Anup Malani and Sabarish Ramachandran, who presented last month, will be releasing portions of their code, such as how they impute time of death. Those of you that came to that seminar will remember they did some very clever things around imputation of time of death, how they deal with the fact that members have zero weights. Other researchers, such as Rosa Abraham, Surbi Kesar, and Amit Pasole, whose research I discussed on the first or the second slide, they will be very happy to put out the code that they used in determining that, for example, daily wage female workers were 7 times more likely to experience job loss than their female salaried counterparts. Right? How did they reach that number? And what did they do to the data to get there? They're going to be willing to release their code so that other researchers can also use that in answering similar questions. Kunal Mangal, who's presenting in September, who has some very interesting work on government jobs and the demand and supply of government jobs, has been gracious enough to agree to make his code available as well for those researchers that might be interested, for example, in studying government jobs. Even those researchers who don't yet have a paper out but are working on important questions, who feel that they can contribute to others, such as Marianne Bertrand and her team of researchers, who've done some very interesting work in trying to map out more completely family relations within a household, using the member roster, using the cross section, using other variables about members like age, like gender, using the time series to see when members enter the household, leave the household, etc., can resolve a lot of the ambiguity in trying to put together the family structure a bit more completely. I thank all of these researchers for being a part of this initiative. We're going to announce more information on this soon. We welcome more and more researchers in the CPHS community to make their code available to other researchers. We really think that along with the data, making available privately developed code by other researchers working in particular fields will really help others in the community who are trying to answer certain questions. So again, I would really like to thank these researchers for agreeing to make their code available. As I said, we will be coming to all of you soon with more details on this. We really hope that both of these initiatives will make a big impact in helping users get the most out of CPHS, and in this case, the most out of individual level data that's collected by virtue of the member roster in the CPHS. Both our push on documentation, as well as this very, very important and community-driven push where private individual researchers that use our data are willing and agreeing to make this code available to others. So we are very, very grateful again to all of the authors and researchers that have agreed to do this. We'll be delighted to host code of anybody else that would like to and would like to contribute to interesting tools that they've developed in massaging the data, in processing the data. And really, that's it. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope this was an important, useful session for all of you. I'd like to remind you again of the events that we have next month as well as in September. Two absolutely great research seminars. One talk, which is going to be a general introduction to CPHS, our sampling, our survey design, what makes CPHS a nationally representative survey, how we run the survey. If you want to know more about that, please come to next month's talk on the introduction to CPHS. And if you'd like to know about stories that have come out of the most recent wave, the wave that's in the field right now, so very fresh stories will be presented to all of you in September, and the same month that this data will be released. That's part of Stories from Wave 23. Thank you all so much for coming. I've seen questions popping up in the Q&A box and I've seen them disappear. So I can only imagine, Mahesh, that you've been answering all of those questions. Mahesh, if you don't mind coming on now, turning on your mic and your camera, and maybe talking to us a little bit about some of the questions that have come in, some of your thoughts in processing the questions, that would be great.
Okay, so as you were saying that all the questions have been answered, one has just popped up just now. Can you explain a bit about the head of household? I think there have been about 4 or 5 questions on this head of household. I have answered it. How is this determined in a group of friends, and what happens when a head leaves the household due to death, immigration, etc.? How is a new head selected? So let me explain again, Pranav. I think you asked the question earlier as well. The head of the household is not a title. It is not truly the head of the household. Like I mentioned on one of the answers, between me and my wife, we can't decide who's the head of the household. And the concept of head of household is kind of alien to many households like mine. So the idea is to select one person as the head of the household so that the other members can be referred to him or her. So it's not necessary that the oldest person or the chief earning member of the household is the head of the household. Any one person could be the head of the household. So for example, if the survey were conducted in my house, it's possible that in the first round, I am the head of the household. If I was interviewed, I would probably claim that I am the head of the household, and I would say my wife is the wife of the head of the household. And the next time, it's possible that my wife claims that she is the head of the household, and Mahesh is the husband of the head of the household. So the head of the household is merely a point of reference by which other members can be related, at least in one direction. So we don't have a complete matrix of everyone's relationship to everybody, but there is a relationship at least to one member of the household. There could be a grandfather who's the head of the household, or there could be an earning member who's at the head of the household, or it could be anybody else. If there are 4 friends living in a household, one of them will say, okay, take me as the head of the household. The rest of them are all my friends, for example. So that's the way it works. The head of the household does not have to be the same from one wave to another. In every wave, that person is only a reference. And you can, in Consumer Pyramids Household Survey, track a person from one wave to another and track whether the person was head of the household in one wave and not the head of the household in another wave. So it's possible to do many of these things. This is not a title. This is just a point of reference. I hope I've answered this question, Pranav. Now, okay, you also say, okay, thank you. So you're asking me to say enough now. So thanks, Pranav, for showing so much of interest in the concept. But I would like to just say one thing, that the member roster was one more of those indicators or set of indicators we created to ensure that we have got a complete accounting of all the people who were surveyed last time, are also there this time, and if they are not there, or if there are new people, how do we account for them? This is an accounting practice which became a very useful thing, which led to people like Anup and others doing excellent work on this to estimate excess deaths during COVID times. But I think what is very important is the way in which CPHS and CPDX in particular, Consumer Pyramids Data Extraction Service, And this webinar, the series of webinar, is really becoming the community creating platform. And the community of all users of household survey in India, where we exchange notes, where CMI thinks it is imperative that it explains itself in as much of detail as it can. And Kaushik has been doing a wonderful job in presenting all that we do systematically, patiently, in series after series. And I hope we're able to answer all the questions you raise in this. But beyond that, beyond we feeling it necessary to explain what we do in as much of detail as we can and answer your questions, we also like an engagement which is two-way. You not only ask questions, but what is wonderful this time is the readiness and the willingness with which all the researchers we approached happily and readily said they're willing to share their code for public access for everyone. This will be great because we know that in these times it is best for as much of research to be replicable. And since the databases are all frozen, all available at all times, the data extraction is all replicable. If the code is also available, then the entire research is replicable. But I think besides the research being replicable, what really excites me over this new initiative is that it easily makes this data and the great work done by researchers accessible to new people. So if the next person, maybe a young person in another university, wants to understand how to allocate deaths in the several months between two interviews, they will just pick up Anup and Sabrish's code and try and replicate it, hopefully even tweak it and learn a little more and throw more light on how the data can be put to use. So I think this is really very exciting, where we not only make the research more credible by making it more replicable, but by making it easy for so many other young researchers to be able to use the same code, to possibly be able to tweak that code, to understand how that analysis works. That's a great opening in making lots of people use the data and learn a lot more. So I think this is very good. I must say, on behalf of CMI, CPHS, all of us over here, and also on behalf of the larger community of users of household survey in India, we must collectively profusely thank all those who have shown such willingness to share their code. Thank you really very, very much.
Absolutely, Mahesh. You hit the nail on the head. We are indebted to every single researcher that's willing to make their code public. It's a great public service that you are performing. Thank you so much. We really think this will create a vibrant community, and we're so glad to be starting this new initiative. Mahesh, I'd like to, sorry, were you about to say something?
No, there are some questions.
Yes. So there are two new questions. Well, one is a statement which I'm sure you would like to respond to. Rekha says we may rename the household as head of the household as household respondent. That's not quite right, Rekha, and I will let Mahesh talk a little bit more about that. The distinction between the respondent and the head of the household and how they don't always have to be the same. Mahesh, would you like to talk about that first, and then we can take up Srihari's question next?
Sure. So oftentimes the household would like to say the head of the household is the grandfather or the father or some such thing. Now you go into interior India, and it's quite possible culturally they would like to say the head of the household is the eldest person or the earning member of the household. But that person may not be the most articulate person who can respond to all our questions. So the respondent can in reality be very different from the head of the household. The head of the household could be not very conversant in the local language, but could be a very, very, very local language. So it's better that we speak with the respondent who's not shy, who's more articulate, and can understand our questions and can respond to as well. So the respondent can be different, and the head of the household can be different. We have a separate marker for a respondent of the household as against the head of the household. So sometimes, and oftentimes, they can be the same. Okay, so I hope I've answered your question adequately. Srihari, when all members of the household shift out, especially within the same village town, is there a plan to continue tracking them in the future? Uh, well, if they shift in the same CEB, in the same census enumeration block, or in the same village, we do track them, we continue tracking them. If the whole household has moved from one apartment, let us say, to another apartment in the same building or in the same CEB, we do continue, but we haven't seen such cases. At least I don't remember such cases. But if it is in the same city, the city could be as big as Bombay or Delhi, and then that's all of everywhere. So then we don't track it. I hope I've answered that question, Srihari. Um, Pranav,
Thanks, Mahesh.
wouldn't that
This
reduce?
is
Yeah, go ahead.
this is a question of coming off of an earlier question that you didn't see, which is on whether we pay monetary incentives or non-monetary incentives to our households. We don't, as you know. And Pranav then asks whether that would reduce non-response rates. Pranav, I'll take a stab at answering this, and Mahesh can add anything more to this. We don't pay incentives because there are ethical complications with this, and there are also survey-related complications with this. If you pay incentives, it will cause, or may very likely cause, all kinds of bias in terms of who's willing to respond in the future. Those people for whom the incentive is sufficient may respond. Those people for whom the incentive is no longer sufficient may not respond. Incentives are expensive to pay when you have a sample as large as 177,000 households and growing. So for a variety of reasons, we don't give households anything to participate in the survey. We are very happy that despite that, response rates are very high. Our average response rates pre-COVID were between 80 and 85%. After the first wave, they started to increase. We almost got to 80% again before the second wave hit. Response rates have been increasing again. We are hopeful that we will reach the 80 to 85% response rate mark yet again. And all of this is done without the payment of incentives. So we don't see any reason, any gain from paying incentives to households in participating in the survey. And we can only see drawbacks in doing so. Mahesh, would you like to add anything to this?
I think you answered it well. I'll just give an example. Suppose we were to give, let us say, 100 rupees for a household responding. I'm just picking a number, or any such number. And if I went to a very, very, very poor locality, and if I was doling out 100 rupees, every neighborhood would come and say, even I'm willing to give you a response, give me the 100 rupees as well. And that creates pressures. So the person who gets it gets into trouble, and the people who don't get it get very upset. So it's best for us not to give the 100 rupees. Instead, what we do is, and again in pre-COVID times, and I hope we can get back there very soon, we every year give a wall calendar. A wall calendar which has a great utility against it. So there's a column for writing dates, for making notes every day. And on the flip side of every page is information from the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. So what's the literacy in the region? What is the pyramid like? And what is the employment like? So a lot of data which has come out from the survey of the previous waves is given state-wise, region-wise on the flip side. And many of the households find that information very useful because in many towns, you don't get this information very easily. In many parts of this country, you don't, and we print them in local languages. So, and here we don't mind giving this calendar to as many people in the neighborhood as who would ask us to give it. There is nothing which skews the sample over here. The calendar is not given depending on whether you have given us a response or not. So giving a gift is good, but making it as a quid pro quo for getting a response is a bad idea.
Absolutely, Mahesh. Thank you. Mahesh, there are two questions that have already been answered, but I'd quickly like for you to maybe elaborate on those two a little bit more, and then we can wrap up the session early. Not too early, we're already 9:46. One was a question from Shan Lee. And I think this bears just a little bit more elucidation. Shan asks if the data collected from May to August will be available in September, including the income and consumption data. Just to add to what you said, Mahesh, and to clarify on this point, the May to August round data, which is being collected right now, will be made available to users as early as the 1st of September. That, however, will not include consumption expenditure information or income information about September. So Shan, this is a little bit complicated, but is a necessity of the way in which we do data collection. Suppose we are in July right now, and we're at the end of July, but still, suppose I go to a household today, I can't ask them about their income and their consumption expenditure this month, because this month isn't even over yet. So they can't give me a complete answer. So the earliest information I can get is income and consumption expenditure from this household for the previous month, which is June. Now, fast forward all the way until the end of August. Even in August, at best, I can only get income and consumption expenditure for a quarter of the total sample, which is the households that were being surveyed in July. As a result, we only will complete for the entire sample of 177,000 odd households, complete information on income and consumption expenditure at the monthly level up until April. So our promise is we release all data that's been collected. And on September 1, the data that will have been collected is only data that talks about income and consumption expenditure monthly until the end of April. Then, in the end of September, or rather the beginning of October, we'll do a first release of the May income and consumption expenditure data, etc., etc., etc. So just to add to what Mahesh already said, all the data collected between May and August as a part of this round will be released on the 1st of September. That will give you very up-to-date information on everything happening to these households. However, there is a lag built in, which cannot be minimized because of the way in which the survey is conducted, which means that the maximum recency of the information that we have on income and consumption expenditure will extend only up until April. But that data will be available. So sorry to belabor the point, but this is something that comes up often. And so Mahesh, I thought I would take a second just to talk about that again. A last thing, Mahesh, because I know this is going to be on the minds of many people. People want to know a lot more about immigrants and immigrants. And this seems to be a question that's come up a lot. I know that we're going to be putting out more documentation on migrants. And I know that you've answered these questions, but very quickly, maybe in a minute again, could you please explain to the audience, because I know this was a bit of a difficult concept for me, even when I joined CPHS, what an immigrant is with an I, what an immigrant is with an E, what we capture on them, and what people can expect to learn more about in the coming weeks and months.
So I did write the answer. I hope that was adequate, but I can explain. So an emigrant is a person who's leaving the household and going away. So there could be, let us say, 4 people in the household. There could be 5, and one person is emigrating out. He's going out of the household somewhere. So the status of the people in the household can be that I continue to be a member of the household, or I emigrate, or I'm dead. So an emigrant could be going out for various reasons, and we note the reasons. You could be emigrating because you're getting a job, or you're going out to study somewhere. So getting to know the reasons why a person is emigrating is a useful way of finding out whether this is an emigrant in the sense that we understand emigrants now. We understand immigrants as people who are poor people living on the footpaths or on construction sites, trudging back home in the lockdown. That's not the only immigrant. The meaning of immigrant in CPHS is a person who's leaving his household or her household to go elsewhere. We track the reasons why the person is emigrating, and also if the person is emigrating for a job or for studies, you also find out where is the person going. So which state, which district, whether rural or urban within that. So I think that is of an immigrant. An immigrant is a person who has come into the household. So if the person has, is not a newborn baby or a young mother, the person could be an immigrant. He could have been working in a city, has come back home in a village. That's an immigrant. Again, we ask, where did you come from? Which district, which state, rural or urban? And even why have you come back as an immigrant? Because you lost a job there, or because the contract is over, or for whatever other reason.
Great. Thank you, Mahesh. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box. So I would like to bring this session to a close. Audience members, as always, thank you for sticking around until the very end. If you have additional questions, our email addresses are on the screen. Please feel free to write to us. We are always eager to talk to anybody about the survey. You don't have to be a subscriber. Just if you have questions, please write to us. We will try to give you as comprehensive and as sensible answers as we can. We hope you found this session useful. It will be available on YouTube immediately after this. The PDF will also be put up on our website. As you know, we have events in August and September. They're going to be very interesting. We look forward to seeing all of you there. For now, that's it from us at CMI. Thank you very much and have a good night. Mahesh, thank you so much for participating, and we'll see all of you again in less than a month's time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.